Okay, let's finish up this first lesson with our last video, looking at the 2 keys to a discipleship culture, because it's one thing to talk about it and to see it in the Bible, and it's another thing to understand how do we make this actually happen. We're going to look at that in a minute. But first, let's just review something we saw in the last video. We saw that ministry leads to maturity, not the other way around. Now, really, if you think about this, this is true in just about anything. The best way to learn something is to try to help someone else understand it. Maybe you've tried to teach somebody math or a math problem, or tried to teach someone some mechanical thing, how to work on a car. One of the best ways to reinforce something in your own mind is to try to teach it to someone else. So that really makes sense. And Paul describes the result in the next verse. In Ephesians chapter 4, we've already looked at verses 11, 12, and 13. In verse 14, he picks back up and he says this: "Then, once we start doing this, we will no longer be infants, tossed back and forth by the waves, blown here and there by every wind of teaching and by the cunning and craftiness of men in their deceitful scheming." Now look at this. This is great. Here's what he's saying. Remember, he's talking about having a discipleship culture. He's basically saying this: when you have a culture where everyone is doing the ministry, not just the pastors, you're no longer going to be infants. If you want your kids, if you're parents, if you want your kids to follow Jesus as they grow older, this verse is saying this: the best way to get your kids to follow Jesus when they get older isn't to just go to a great church with a great pastor who can wow them with his great teaching, or get him in a youth group with a great youth pastor who's really cool and hip. There's nothing wrong with those things, but that's not the best way to get them to stay the course in their faith. The best way to do it, according to Ephesians 4, is to empower them to do ministry. If you want your kids to love Jesus into their old age, empower them now while they're young to do ministry. If you want to shut the back door to your church, empower the people in your church to do ministry. Back to our definition. A church with a discipleship culture is a place where every believer shares the responsibility of discipling people. This kind of church is an awesome church because everyone's in the game, everyone's doing ministry, everybody cares about whether people are going to hell or not. Everybody cares about what God is doing in their church because they're not spectators anymore. That's an Ephesians 4 church, and it changes the lives of everyone involved. Now, one more thing for today, and this is what we're going to talk about in the next lesson next week when we come back together. It's easy to say we want everyone sharing this responsibility of pastoring, but here's the question you're probably thinking right now: are they equipped? I mean, after all, we want to make disciples, not heretics. If we just give away this ministry to everybody, if tomorrow you go to church and say, "Listen, everybody, everyone else go pastor someone else," what's the result going to be? What are we going to end up with? I mean, your argument might be something like this. Pastors go to seminary, they go through training, they know how to articulate finer truths of theology, they know how to make the connections to everyday life, they know how to counsel people in pastoral counseling, they know how to help people apply it to their lives. All of this stuff is true. All of these things are things that pastors learn in seminary. But let's go back to Ephesians chapter 4, and let's see what Paul has to say about this, about equipping people. Look at what he says in verse 15. "Instead, speaking the truth in love, we will in all things grow up into him who is the head, that is Christ. For from him the whole body, joined and held together by every supporting ligament, grows and builds itself up in love as each part does its work." See, Paul is saying what all of us know, and maybe we have a hard time articulating it. It's one thing to love people pastorally, and everyone can love people. But that's one key to a discipleship culture, is loving people, caring for people. But if you can't speak truth to people, then you're not really discipling them, because the second key to a disciple maker is the ability to speak truth. We can't just love people into the kingdom. We have to share the specifics of the gospel, right? We have to share the truth of God's word, how it relates to theology, how it relates to marriage, how it relates to pornography, how it relates to finances and to parenting and all this stuff, right? And this is what you're saying. You're looking at this and you're saying this: how am I going to equip the people in my church to be able to be a good pastor? And a good pastor is someone who can speak truth in love. Not just truth and not just love, but both things. And if this is going to work, people have to know how to do it. And then the whole church can grow because each part will be doing its own work. This is why we've built pursuegod.org. It's there to help people speak truth to those that they love. PursueGod.org is a library of short videos on just about every topic designed to activate Ephesians 4. Pastors articulate God's truth with clarity and conviction via the video library so people can do the ministry. And the ministry is sharing truth and love with people in their life that they have time for and can connect to. So here's your homework before next week. 2 things you can do. Number 1, if you're not familiar with the library at PursueGod.org, spend some time looking at it. Now, the other thing you might want to do is pick up the book Wiki Church by Steve Morrell. He talks about all of these concepts in that book. It's an awesome church with a discipleship culture. Now, before you go, why don't you hit pause and talk about these questions in red, talk some more about discipleship culture and establishing it in your church, and do some of that homework for next week, and we'll see you next week for week 2 in this series.